Did you know what happened 7 days ago? What happened 7 days ago? We went over week 3 of the Mythic Plus meta. So now it's been 7 days, and now we're going over week 4 of the Mythic Plus meta, with also the extra day, the extra couple of days at the beginning of week 5, which are somewhat relevant because of the balance tuning that was added in this weekly reset, particularly relevant for the more buffed spec in this weekly reset, which was Beast Mastery Hunter. So as it's always fun to look at these things just to point out how little they matter most of the time because of how varying they can be, except sometimes for the top specs which stay at the top for a long time. For example, if you look at this was the week 3 best DPS performers in Mythic Plus, and then you move from week 3 to week 4. Yes, of course, Frost Death Knight is still here. In fact, what a surprise, if we move into the first couple of days of week 5, Frost Death Knight is still there. However, what's funny to check, for example, is that you look into week 3 and you have Fury Warrior as the second worst performer, and then you move into week 4 and Fury is here. Right, that's how little you can gauge these results just for the wider audience in Mythic Plus keys. If you want to see a trend of the performances, you would have to look at the higher level keys. Now, the one thing though that will be interesting to check, not just from week 3 and week 4, but in this week, now we're only a couple of days in, will be of course the performance of BM Hunter, because for example, last week you ended up with almost 10k marksmanship hunters in the top level keys all the way up to plus 19s, compared to only 5k BM hunters. Meanwhile, now we're only a couple of days into this week, but BM hunters already are surpassing marksmanship hunters in Mythic Plus higher keys. You can also see this pictured in the meta in the top 2000 keys. These are the melee picks. Obviously, there is a great advantage for Frost DK, followed by Havoc Demon Hunter, still in a pretty commanding lead over the rest. The rest currently being led by Fury Warrior. However, when you move to the ranged meta, first of all, you have the confirmation that at the moment you do have more room for melee specs to be popular over the ranged ones. However, in the ranged camp, you have Arcane as the more popular one, and then just now you have gotten BM to surpass marksmanship and to make it into the top 3. Now, one of the curious things that of course has been discovered since a few weeks ago is the fact that BM is currently running without multi-shot, or at the very least quite a few builds are running without multi-shot. And you know, some of you who haven't played BM in a while or never even did, but only had a general idea of how it worked, are already asking, hold on a second, don't you need multi-shot to activate Beast Cleave, which is the one main way for you to do AoE, right? You need to multi-shot, trigger Beast Cleave so your pets can actually do AoE, right? When you look at the damage, Beast Cleave will be the main chunk of your damage in AoE in Mythic Plus. Well, the discovery is that nowadays you have so many ways to do AoE damage. First of all, as pack leader, your beasts that you summon, the boar and the bear, are both doing AoE by themselves. Stomp is already an AoE by itself whenever you barb shot, and then you have the entire dire beast line that you go for in Mythic Plus, where you have, when summoned, dire beasts gain Beast Cleave at full effectiveness for 8 seconds. So you don't even need to multi-shot to trigger this, you can simply get the dire beasts to pop out and you gain Beast Cleave anyways. So what happens when you discover that you really don't need multi-shot is that you can now remove those 3 talents down the line of multi-shot and spend them elsewhere. Spend them in more useful talents to, for example, increase your single target damage without losing much of any AoE. in exchange, which is as a result quite good right now. BM is doing quite well in Mythic Plus. Obviously at the moment it's not really one of the top specs in Mythic Plus, but it's only been a couple of days, and also even if it were to become quite good at the moment, it would set itself up to be one of the prime targets to be in physical comps. Also the so-called melee comps. Generally speaking, when players mention melee comps or physical comps, they are referring, yes, to specs like Arms or Fury or Enhancement, Ret, Havoc, Frost Decay, Feral Druid, but also the Hunters. Marksmanship, BM, since they do a lot of physical damage or they scale with attack power anyways, they are still part of the whole, melee comps. That is where you could see BM Hunter grow. Obviously, if you look at the results at the moment, in the past couple of weeks of BM Hunter, they are awful. They are at the very bottom of the average score at top level, past 3k, 3.2, 3.3k score. BM is towards the bottom. We will see. We will see at the end of this week how much have they gained from the number one. The number one being Arcane at the moment is, I believe, 190. Clean 190 score ahead on average than BM. We will see at the beginning of the next reset if this gap will have closed a little bit. Now, in terms of popularity, you do have the healer situation still staying pretty much the exact same, and by that we mean that this was how ahead Resto Shaman was of Resto Druid last week, and this is how ahead Resto Shaman is of Resto Druid this week. So didn't really change much. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio between Resto Shamans and Resto Druids. You can also see the spread in the top Mythic Plus comps, where it does look quite even, because you do see like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different Resto Druids and only 1, 2, 3 Resto Shamans, so it's like wow. But 2 of the top 3 of the most popular comps, which are gapping the others by quite a bit, are both Resto Shamans. So it is actually closer between the two, still at a very high level. But what is more visible here is the growth of Prot Paladin. If you compare this to the tanks being played last week, and then you look at the tanks being played now, of course you do have at the same time Vengeance dropping by quite a bit, going below Brewmaster, and then Prot Paladin getting closer to Prot Warrior. It is, as we mentioned, visible even in the top comps at 16 keys or higher that Prot Paladin is being played more. And just like Resto Shaman, 2 of the top 3 comps, in fact 3 of the top 4 comps are played with a Prot Paladin. So while the healer situation is still the same, at the general large scale level, Resto Shaman is outnumbering Resto Druid 3-to-1. The numbers do get closer to not quite a 50-50. Resto Shaman is still ahead, but not nearly as ahead as before. And then in this week, compared to the previous one, we have seen more Prot Paladins becoming relevant in high keys compared to Prot Warriors. What is relevant though, and what I would like to shed light on at the moment, is that yes, right now there is only a handful, in fact almost a handful if you lost a finger in some industrial work accident and you only had 4 fingers, only yes, a handful of DPS specs completed a plus 20 in time. Arcane, Frost Decay, Marksmanship and Elemental. But what is worth putting the highlight on is that at the moment there is quite the healthy spread of specs able to complete a plus 19, which is basically, well, literally just 1 level below the very, very top, and also the highest level currently for quite a lot of keys, because yes, plus 20s have been completed, but only on the easiest keys, of course. So Ecodome, Streets, Gambit and Halls of Atonement. Those are pretty much right now the easiest ones, while all of the others are still at plus 19. So being able to see at the moment specs like Destro Warlock, Demo Warlock, Balanced Druid, the new, I guess we can say the new BM Hunter, and also surprise perhaps Devastation Evoker, all completing a plus 19. And then on the melee side you have Havoc, Subtlety, Outlaw, Feral, Ret, and Fury. It is quite a large amount of specs being able to complete very high keys. In fact, the second highest key level for half the keys and the highest key level for the other half of the keys. Obviously, this season is planned and scheduled to go much higher in key level. By the time we will be done with the Turbo Boost event, giving us 6 more item level, as well as our best in slot options from the dinar, we will likely go up to 25 to 26-ish level keys, so there will be more room to have a larger spread between the top level specs and the bottom level specs. But for now there is quite a lot of specs being close to each other, which is also why when you look at the most popular comps, yes, there is plenty of popular ones with a big gap compared to the others, of course, but there is still a large amount of different builds, different comps, different possibilities towards the bottom. Yes, it doesn't actually change much for basically 4 out of 5, because even in those lower ones you still see Prot Paladin or Prot Warrior, you still see Resto Shaman or Resto Druid, you still see Frost DK practically everywhere. The 4th spot is basically Havoc or Arcane, but the 5th one, if you look at the 5th one, you can see Destro, Ret, Shadow Priest, Assassination, Subtlety, Balance, Marksmanship, Fury Warrior. So you do see a whole different array of possibilities when it comes to DPS options. You can even see this pictured right now in the top level keys. You do see, for example, that yes, these are currently some of the more popular comps, but then you also see, for example, the melee comps being played quite a bit. You know, the melee comps with a Resto Shaman, even more melee comps with a Brewmaster Monk for the physical damage debuff. You also see different kind of monk groups with the same comp. This time it's a sub rogue instead of an outlaw rogue. Different key, this time the same warrior goes from fury to arms. You do see, for example, Banshee's group also running a melee comp with BM taking the place of a melee spot. Crit Cake's group is also currently running a melee comp right now, and this comp being an option and being able to be played in this high level of key, this 19, is very good. It does leave the door open for quite a few different kind of specs, namely, you know, melee specs, since at the moment the 2 more played melee specs in your traditional comp would be just Frost DK and Havoc. If you add this comp also being playable, then you open the possible door to specs like Feral, Sub, Assassination, Ret, Fury Warrior, so you do have even more options to have your comp in Mythic Plus. We will see, obviously, at the end of this week with the buffs to Beast Mastery and the smaller, but possibly still relevant, buffs to Balance Druid, if any of these specs will gain more relevance in Mythic Plus. To finish, as a complete side note, we are going to look not actually at the most popular comps, which we already know at this point, but rather at the comps with the highest success rate. That's why you see a significant change in some of these specs, perhaps surprising ones, like Elemental suddenly becomes the comp with the highest success rate, 90% success rate if you run with this comp. Funnily enough, the second most successful one has a Marksmanship Hunter, and then it has a Destro Warlock. So just mentioned the popular comps being the same: Havoc, Arcane, Frost DK, and then we look at the ones with the most success rate, and they are not that comp. One has an Elemental instead of Havoc, one has a Marksmanship Hunter instead of Arcane, and one has a Destro Warlock instead of a Frost DK. So one by one, the top 3 DPS have all been replaced and their success rate is higher. What doesn't change though, again, seems like the only constant in these groups are the tank and the healer, either Prot Warrior or Prot Paladin or Resto Shaman and Resto Druid. As said, we will see by the end of this week, our next video next week, the changes after the buffs to BM and Balance Druid. But for now, this is what we see in terms of the meta in Mythic Plus, as groups are starting to get towards the 20 level of keys, which will of course continue to increase as players continue to increase their item level. Remember that right now most players in these groups are in the 711 to 14, I guess, depending on whether or not they mythic raid and whether or not they did get gear from mythic raiding. And that is still about 10 item levels away from the max right now, which is pretty much 10% more damage, 10% more healing and more stamina. And also, by the time they will get to that point, in fact, you won't even have time to get to that 723 max item level, because in supposedly 4 resets, the turbo boost event will come, which will raise our average item level or our max item level up to 729 for even more power gains. So for now though, this is what we have when it comes to the situation in Mythic Plus, between the meta of tanks, healers, DPS and their compositions so far in high level keys, which, as we know, they will eventually then trickle down to the general population, which will just copy what the top groups are doing. So for today, on this Thursday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, no, why is the sun out? Especially, why are we closer to 30 degrees than we are to 20? September? This was not the deal.